In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by an invisible wind, a new legend is about to be forged in the crucible of collapse. This is not a story of heroes, but of survivors. It is a parable of dirt and dollars, of a quiet man and a loud lesson that shattered the foundations of a fragile world. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. For one man, the end of the world was just the beginning. The dust tasted like poverty. Ben Thorne knew the flavor intimately, a phantom seasoning on every meager meal. It was the fine, gritty powder that coated the back of his throat as he stared down at his dinner of plain white rice, the steam rising like a ghost from the bowl. A single, naked bulb hung from a frayed cord above his worn kitchen table, casting a sterile, lonely light that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. The light illuminated the deep lines of worry etched around his 28-year-old eyes, making him look a decade older. They were the eyes of a man who had been staring into the abyss for so long, he'd forgotten the color of the sky. The farm, 150 acres of legacy and labor, was a monument to a slow, agonizing death. It had been left to him by a grandfather he barely remembered, a man who existed more as a myth than a memory. Now that myth was crumbling. The fields lay fallow, their soil exhausted and gray. The equipment, relics from a more prosperous era, surrendered to rust in the cavernous silence of the barn, their faded green and yellow paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The whole place was bleeding out, not with a bang, but with a slow, seeping hemorrhage of hope. But Ben harbored a secret, a comfort, a shield he had forged himself against the encroaching darkness. After swallowing the last bland spoonful, a lump of starch and resignation, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The scrape of his chair against the linoleum was the only sound. He stood and walked to his bedroom, the floorboards groaning under his weight, each sound a complaint from the tired, old house that held the ghosts of 3 generations of Thorne men. He knelt, the worn denim of his jeans protesting, and reached under the bed. His fingers, still soft from a lack of meaningful farm work, found the familiar, cool, slick texture of a heavy-duty plastic bag. He pulled it out, the crinkle of the plastic unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Inside, meticulously counted and bundled with brittle rubber bands, was his salvation. $10,000. Every cent he had scrimped and saved. A decade of denial compressed into stacks of paper. Every small luxury he had foregone. Every social invitation he had declined. Every ounce of his youthful energy converted not into growth, but into preservation. He carefully spread the bundles on his patchwork quilt, the faded faces of dead presidents staring up at him in the dim, judgmental light. In that moment, he wasn't a farmer, not really. He was a curator. This was his museum of security, and he was its sole, obsessive guardian. "I'm safe," he whispered, the words a desperate prayer hurled against the howling wind that rattled the window panes. He needed to hear it said aloud to believe it. He felt the familiar narcotic calm settle over his frayed nerves. This was real. This was tangible. This was a wall, thick and high, between him and the chaos of the world. For Ben, the wall he had so carefully constructed was about to be revealed for what it truly was. A dam made of sand, facing a tsunami. The next morning, the sky was a sheet of brushed steel, promising a heat that would bake the failure deeper into the cracked earth. The old John Deere coughed its last. It wasn't a gentle fading, but a gut-wrenching screech of metal grinding on metal, a mechanical death rattle that echoed across the silent fields. A plume of greasy black smoke erupted from the exhaust stack, a final, obscene gesture, and then silence. A profound, expensive silence that settled over the farm like a shroud. Ben knew that sound, had dreaded it in his nightmares. The hydraulic pump. The tractor's iron heart had just seized, a catastrophic metal aneurysm. His own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of bone. The wave of panic was so intense it threatened to pull him under. But then something else surfaced through the fear, a grim, cold resolve. This was it. This was the moment the wall was built for. An emergency. An investment to bring the farm, his legacy, back from the brink. He went inside and pulled on his cleanest shirt, the one that wasn't yet frayed at the collar, a pathetic symbol of a man trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. He drove his sputtering pickup truck the 20 miles into town, the plastic bag of cash, his entire net worth, tucked under the passenger seat like a guilty secret. Miller's Parts and Supply was a time capsule. It smelled the same as it had when he was a boy trailing his grandfather through the aisles. A potent, layered aroma of motor oil, vulcanized rubber, and the stale, burnt coffee that perpetually simmered on a hot plate behind the counter. The air was thick with the dust of decades. Old Man Miller, a man who looked as if he'd been carved from a piece of weathered oak and left in the sun too long, peered at him over spectacles perched on the end of his nose. His eyes were small and shrewd, missing nothing. "Hydraulic pump for a '78 John Deere 4440, Ben said, his voice steadier than he felt. His hands, shoved deep into his pockets, were slick with sweat. Miller let out a grunt that could have meant anything. He shuffled to a wall of dusty catalogs, his movements slow and deliberate, and ran a gnarled, grease-stained finger down a page. He hummed a tuneless, grating melody, a sound that scraped at Ben's nerves. The suspense was a physical weight. Ben could already feel the satisfying heft of the new part in his hands, could already hear the glorious roar of the tractor's engine coming back to life, a sound that would mean hope. "Yep, got one in the back," Miller said, his gaze still fixed on the page. "Special order, but I got one collecting dust back there." A wave of relief washed over Ben, so potent it almost made him dizzy. The wall would hold. "How much?" he asked, the words catching in his dry throat. Miller squinted at the page, then at a laminated price list taped to the counter, its edges yellowed and peeling. He took off his glasses and began polishing them with a greasy rag, drawing out the moment with the casual cruelty of a man who held all the power. The silence in the shop stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the buzzing of a fly against a dirty window pane. $12,154, he said, finally looking up. "Plus tax." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds disconnected from meaning, like a language he didn't speak. Ben blinked, his mind struggling to process the assault. I'm sorry, I think you misread that," he stammered, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "I priced one out last year. It was around 9, maybe 10,000. Miller's face was a mask of indifference. He slid his glasses back on, and his eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, were flat and devoid of sympathy. "That was last year, son. Shipping's up, steel's up. The whole damn world is up. You want it or not. Got another fella over in West Creek, name of Henderson, who will be calling about it by noon. His is starting to whine. $12,000. The number echoed in the cavern of Ben's skull, a death knell for his meticulously constructed world. His $10,000, his salvation, his wall against the abyss wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold tide receding, leaving him pale and hollow. The neatly bundled stacks of cash under the seat of his truck suddenly felt like a pile of children's play money. He had been saving. He had been frugal. He had been responsible. He had done everything he was told was right. And in the space of a single year, by standing perfectly still, he had become $2,000 poorer than broke. The dust was back in his throat, but this time it tasted of pure, suffocating humiliation. He stumbled out of the store without another word, the sound of Miller's tuneless humming following him out into the oppressive sunlight. The drive home was a blur of sun-bleached fields and telephone poles flashing by in a hypnotic, mocking rhythm. Each pole was a tally mark counting off his failures. The plastic bag of money on the seat next to him felt radioactive, a toxic reminder not of his security, but of his profound ignorance. It wasn't a shield. It was an anchor, and it had just dragged him to the bottom of an ocean of debt he couldn't even afford to enter. The horrifying clarity of it all was a physical pain, a sharp, stabbing realization in his gut. While he had been hoarding his paper dollars, reverently counting them in the dim light of his bedroom, the real world had kept moving. The cost of tangible things, the steel of a tractor part, the diesel in his tank, the food on the grocery store shelves, had been quietly, relentlessly marching forward, a silent army leaving him hopelessly behind. He was a man trying to outrun a freight train by standing still on the tracks, clutching a ticket he thought was priceless, only to discover it was for a journey that had departed a year ago. He turned onto the long dirt road leading to his property, the truck's tires kicking up a plume of the very dust that defined his life. And then he saw him. His neighbor, Joe Riley, was out mending a fence line, his back broad and tanned under the harsh sun. Joe was everything Ben wasn't: impulsive, perpetually in debt, always taking a gamble on some new scheme. Last spring, Ben had watched with a kind of smug, secret pity as Joe sold his old, reliable combine, a machine that worked, and took out yet another loan from the bank to buy a small herd of Hereford cattle. Putting all your eggs in a basket full of vet bills and hay costs, Ben had muttered to himself at the time, his hand instinctively going to the reassuring bulge of his own secret stash of cash. He'd felt so smart, so secure in his cautious wisdom. Now, as he slowed his truck to a crawl, the engine rattling in protest, he saw the fruits of Joe's so-called recklessness. The pasture, green from a recent rain, was dotted with not just the original 5 cows, but a half-dozen sturdy, healthy calves, their red and white coats vibrant against the landscape. They were living, breathing, growing assets. Joe, seeing Ben's truck, wiped the sweat from his brow with a forearm and gave a wide, genuine, uncomplicated wave. Ben could only manage a weak, palsied nod in return. The comparison was a physical blow. Ben, the man with a head for numbers, did the math, his mind numb with shock. Joe had likely bought the cows for maybe $3,000 a head. Those calves, come fall, would be worth at least that much themselves. Joe hadn't just preserved his capital, he had multiplied it. He had transformed a bank loan into a living factory that produced more value, while Ben's cash sat under a mattress, slowly being devoured by an invisible moth he hadn't even known existed. A wave of nausea churned in his stomach. Joe hadn't been reckless, he had been savvy. He had traded paper promises for protein, currency for creation. And Ben, the cautious, frugal saver, the man who prided himself on his discipline, had been the biggest damn fool in the entire county. He pressed his foot on the accelerator, leaving Joe and his thriving herd behind, but he couldn't escape the devastating truth they represented. He was poorer than his indebted neighbor, and the worst part was, he had done it entirely to himself. That night, sleep offered no escape. It was a shallow, turbulent sea of anxiety. Ben tossed and turned in his sweat-dampened sheets, the ghost of Miller's voice quoting the impossible price. The image of Joe's thriving calves burned into the back of his eyelids. He felt trapped, a fly in a sealed jar, buzzing uselessly against the glass while the air grew thin. Every creak of the old house sounded like a judgment. Every gust of wind whispered the word *failure*. Sometime around 3 in the morning, drenched in a cold sweat, he gave up the fight. He padded barefoot into the living room, the worn floorboards cold against his skin. Moonlight, pale and sterile, streamed through the grimy windows, painting the worn furniture in shades of silver and gray, making the familiar room look alien and spectral. His gaze fell upon the mantelpiece, upon the single-framed photograph that was the farm's only remaining icon. It was his grandfather, Samuel Thorne, a man Ben knew only from second-hand stories and this one fading image. He was a lean, hard man, photographed standing in a field of wheat so tall it reached his chest. He had eyes that seemed to know the secrets of the sun and soil, and a wry half-smile played on his lips, as if he knew a cosmic joke the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. Ben took the photo down, the dust on the glass cold and gritty against his fingertips. He stared into those knowing, 70-year-old eyes, searching for an answer he couldn't articulate. And then a memory, distant and fragmented, began to surface from the deep well of his childhood. It rose slowly at first, then rushed forward with a startling clarity. He was a boy, no older than 7, sitting on his grandfather's knee on this very porch. The old man smelled of tobacco and rich earth. He'd been trying to explain something to Ben, something the boy's mind, obsessed with cartoons and candy, couldn't grasp at the time. He had held up a crisp dollar bill in one hand and a handful of wheat kernels in the other. "What's this worth, Benny?" his grandfather had asked, his voice a low rumble pointing to the dollar. "A dollar," young Ben had chirped proudly, pleased with his own cleverness. "And this?" his grandfather had asked, opening his other hand to show the golden grains, smooth and perfect. "I dunno." "Seeds," his grandfather had chuckled, a sound like stones tumbling in a riverbed. "This paper," he'd said, flicking the dollar bill with his thumb, "is a promise. It's a ticket to buy things, but promises can be broken, Benny. Tickets can expire. Now this wheat, this is a asterisk thing. You put this in the ground, you give it sun and water and a bit of yourself, and it becomes more. It becomes bread. It becomes life. It becomes a future." The memory sharpened, the words echoing across 2 decades with the startling clarity of a struck bell. He remembered his grandfather's final, cryptic piece of advice, a phrase that had meant nothing to him then, but was now a devastating indictment of his entire life. "Listen to me, boy. Don't ever store your grain in a leaky barn. The rats and the rot will get it every time. And don't ever store your value in paper. An invisible rat gets that too. A fat, greedy rat. It's called inflation. An invisible rat." The phrase hit Ben with the force of a physical impact, knocking the wind from his lungs. He sank into a dusty armchair, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He finally understood. His savings, his fortress of security under the bed, was the leakiest barn imaginable. The $10,000 was his grain, his entire harvest from a decade of toil, and the invisible rat had been feasting on it, day after day, year after year, while he slept, dreaming he was safe. A final piece of his grandfather's wisdom surfaced, a simple, brutal truth he'd once overheard him telling his father. "You can't eat money. You can only eat what money buys today." And what his money could buy today was terrifyingly, ruinously less than what it could buy yesterday. The wall hadn't just been breached, it had been an illusion all along. The sun rose on a different man. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but it was now overshadowed by something else. A desperate, burning, clarifying rage. A rage at the system, at the invisible rat, but mostly a rage at his own blindness. He was done being a victim. He was done watching his future evaporate into thin air. His paralysis had shattered, replaced by a terrifying sense of purpose. He spent the entire morning on the old dial-up internet connection, the screech and whine of the modem, the sound of a new world, a new strategy, opening up to him. He didn't look for tractor parts. He researched livestock auctions, Hereford breeding lines, feed costs, and pasture management. He made calls on his crackling landline, his voice gaining confidence with each conversation. He was no longer asking questions like a man who was lost. He was gathering intelligence like a soldier planning an assault. At 10 a.m., he walked into the small county bank, the same one his father and grandfather had used. The air inside was cool and sterile, smelling of industrial cleaning fluid and quiet desperation. It was a place where dreams went to be collateralized. Mr. Caldwell, the bank manager, a man whose soft, uncalloused hands and starched white collar seemed an affront to the sun-beaten world just outside the door, greeted him with a practiced, condescending smile. "Benjamin, good to see you. Come to open a certificate of deposit, a wise choice in these uncertain times. Lock in a rate, stay safe, protect what you have." The irony was so thick Ben could taste it. "I'm here to make a withdrawal," Ben said, his voice flat, devoid of the deference Caldwell expected. He pushed the heavy plastic bag of cash across the polished wood counter. "All of it. In hundreds." Caldwell's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of professional concern mixed with personal judgment. He raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "Liquidating your entire savings. Mr. Thorne, if I may be so bold, that seems rash. Prudent men are holding tight to their capital right now. The markets are volatile." "I'm not feeling very prudent today, Mr. Caldwell," Ben replied, holding the man's gaze, a silent challenge passing between them. He saw in Caldwell's eyes the same smug pity he'd once felt for Joe Riley. The banker, the gatekeeper of paper promises, looked away first, flustered. An hour later, Ben was driving not toward his farm, but away from it, heading east on the state highway toward the largest livestock auction in the region. The $10,000, now crisp and clean in official bank wrappers, sat on the passenger seat. It felt different now. It wasn't a hoard to be protected. It was ammunition to be spent. He was no longer a curator of a dying museum. He was a hunter. The auction house was a chaotic symphony of sound and smell. The frantic, rhythmic bellowing of cattle, the rapid-fire, hypnotic chant of the auctioneer, the thick, earthy aroma of hay, manure, and nervous sweat. Farmers in dusty caps and worn boots stood in tight knots, their faces grim masks of calculation, sizing each other up. Ben felt their eyes on him as he walked in, a collective, dismissive glance. They saw the broke Thorne boy, his family's slow decline a piece of local lore. They saw his clean shirt and his tense, nervous energy and pegged him instantly. He was a tourist in a world of hardened professionals, a lamb walking into a den of wolves. He let their dismissal fuel him, hardening his resolve. He found a spot in the stands, ignoring the cheap steers and the aging dairy cows that were paraded through the ring. He waited, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, his grandfather's words echoing in his mind. "Buy the best, and the best will pay you back. Quality breeds quality." Finally, they came into the ring. A pair of prime Hereford heifers, their coats a deep, rich red, their bodies strong and perfectly formed, with the calm, steady eyes of superior breeding stock. The placard announced their origin, the legendary Black Creek Ranch, their lineage a guarantee of quality. They were the kind of animals that built legacies, not just herds. The bidding started fast, a flurry of subtle nods and raised fingers from the seasoned ranchers in the front rows. Ben's hand, resting on his knee, felt impossibly heavy, welded in place by a lifetime of fear and caution. This was it, the precipice, the point of no return. He was about to trade every dime of his security for two living creatures that could get sick, get struck by lightning, or simply fail to breed. The sheer, unadulterated risk of it was dizzying. He thought of the rusted tractor sitting silent in the barn, of the endless bowls of bland rice, of Mr. Caldwell's pitying smile. He thought of the invisible rat still feasting. He raised his hand. The auctioneer's gaze flickered to him for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise in his professional cadence. The price climbed, the numbers a ladder to his salvation or his ruin. 7,000. 8. The other bidders were established ranchers with deep pockets and generations of experience. Ben was a ghost at the feast, a nobody with nothing but a desperate idea. 9,000. One of the other bidders dropped out with a decisive shake of his head. It was down to Ben, and a large, red-faced man in a stained cowboy hat who had been looking at Ben with open contempt since he'd first raised his hand. This was Henderson, the man Miller had mentioned, the local kingpin. 9-5, the auctioneer chanted, his voice a mesmerizing rhythm. Ben's hand went up again, a jerky, unnatural movement. Every head in the viewing stand seemed to turn toward him. A murmur went through the crowd. Who the hell is the Thorne kid bidding against Henderson for Black Creek stock? Henderson scowled, his face darkening, and gave a sharp, angry nod. 10,000, the auctioneer called out, the sound ringing through the arena. Ben's stomach turned to ice. It was all he had, every single cent. He couldn't go a dollar higher. He was trading his entire past for a fragile, uncertain future. For a brief, agonizing moment, he considered lowering his hand, retreating back to the miserable safety of his paper money, back to the leaky barn. Then an image flashed in his mind, the healthy, thriving calves in Joe Riley's field. He saw his grandfather's knowing, half-smile in the faded photograph. He gave a sharp, definitive nod, a gesture of finality. The auctioneer's eyes locked on Henderson. The big man hesitated, his arrogance warring with his prudence. He chewed on his lip, shot a venomous glare at Ben, and then, with a curse spat onto the concrete floor, he shook his head and turned away. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a gunshot. For $10,000 to the young man in the back. The room was silent for a beat, a collective intake of breath. Then it erupted into a buzz of conversation. Ben felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, a mixture of shock, pity, and a new, grudging respect. He didn't care. He walked down the steps to the payment desk, his legs shaking but his head held high. He pushed the neat stacks of $100 bills across the counter. He was officially, completely, terrifyingly broke. And for the first time in his entire life, he felt rich. The journey home, with his 2 new charges secured in a borrowed trailer, was the longest of Ben's life. He drove slowly, cautiously, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He had named them on the drive, hope and legacy. They were more than just cattle. They were the physical embodiment of his pivot, the living, breathing proof of his grandfather's forgotten wisdom. Getting them settled in the old barn, which he had feverishly cleaned and repaired in the days prior, was a ritual, a consecration. He filled the trough with fresh, cold water from the well, forked the sweetest hay from the loft, and spoke to them in low, soothing tones, his voice a strange sound in the long, silent structure. That night he didn't eat rice. He cooked himself a proper meal, using the last of his canned goods, a thick beef stew, and ate it on the porch, watching the 2 red and white forms move gracefully in the moonlit pasture. The money under the mattress would have just sat there, a dead, sterile, shrinking thing. It couldn't grow. It couldn't create. These animals, however, were alive with potential. They were complex biological machines, converting grass into muscle, water into life. They were a dynamic, productive force in a world of static, decaying paper. The weeks turned into months. The blistering autumn chill gave way to the deep, biting freeze of winter. Ben's life found a new rhythm, one dictated not by fear and hoarding, but by relentless work and profound responsibility. His days were measured by the sun, not the clock. He mucked out stalls in the pre-dawn dark, the steam from his breath mingling with that of the animals. He hauled heavy bales of hay, his muscles screaming in protest. He broke thick sheets of ice in the water trough with a heavy axe, the sharp cracks echoing in the frozen air. His hands, once soft from disuse, became calloused and strong, the skin splitting and healing, a testament to his new reality. The fat he had carried from worry and inactivity melted away, replaced by lean, hard-earned muscle. He was tired, bone-tired at the end of each day, but it was a good, clean exhaustion. It was the fatigue of creation, not the wearying attrition of anxiety. One bitter afternoon in January, a blizzard descended on the county, a swirling vortex of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted. Ben fought his way to the barn, the wind tearing at him, to find Hope shivering violently, her breathing shallow and ragged. A local vet would have cost hundreds he didn't have, a death sentence. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He had gambled everything, and the universe was already calling his bluff. He ran back to the house, rummaging through a dusty trunk until he found what he was looking for. His grandfather's old journals, filled with handwritten notes on animal husbandry, remedies passed down through generations. For 2 days and nights, he didn't sleep. He brewed herbal concoctions described in the spidery script, forced warm water and molasses down the heifer's throat, and covered her with every blanket he owned, huddling with her in the straw for warmth. He was fighting not just for an animal, but for his own future. On the third morning, the blizzard broke, and he found Hope standing on her own, weakly chewing a mouthful of hay. The crisis had passed. He had faced his first real test as a producer, a steward of life, and he had won. He learned the subtle language of his animals, the low moo that meant contentment, the sharp flick of an ear that signaled annoyance, the look in their eyes that spoke of trust. He found a quiet, profound joy in their simple existence. He was a farmer again, not a curator of dead paper, but a producer of something real. One cold morning in late March, as the first signs of spring were beginning to fight their way through the frozen ground, he went out to the barn and found Legacy lying on her side, her great body contracting, her breathing heavy and labored. Panic seized him again, but this time it was different, edged with anticipation. He had poured everything into her, into them. If he lost her, he lost it all. But then he saw it. A small, wet, and utterly perfect calf, slick and new, struggling to get to its feet on wobbly, uncertain legs. A bull calf, strong and healthy. Ben sank to his knees in the clean straw, a laugh bubbling up from deep in his chest, a sound so full of relief and pure, unadulterated joy it barely sounded like him. He had spent $10,000. The value of that cash, left in a bank or under his mattress, would have remained $10,000 on paper, while its real-world power was being steadily eroded by the invisible rat. But his 2 cows, now 3, had nearly doubled the tangible value of his initial investment in less than a year. The calf was living, breathing proof. It was growth. It was life. It was wealth. The paper promises couldn't do that. Only real things, real assets, could multiply. The news started as a whisper. A nervous rumor passed between farmers at the feed store, a worried headline buried on page 6 of the financial section. Financial instability, market volatility, banking sector concerns. The words were soft, clinical, euphemisms designed to soothe rather than alarm. But Ben, who now spent his evenings reading not just livestock journals but complex financial reports online, understood the coded language of evasion. The system was trembling. He saw the signs everywhere. The price of fuel creeping up daily. The cost of feed making a sudden, inexplicable jump. He overheard worried, hushed conversations in town about friends losing jobs, about companies quietly laying people off. The whispers became a roar. It started with a large, prestigious investment bank in the city, a name synonymous with stability, declaring bankruptcy overnight. The stock market, a construct of pure confidence, plummeted in a single day of panicked selling. People woke up to find their retirement accounts gutted, their life savings, numbers on a screen turned to digital dust. The government appeared on television, men in expensive suits with reassuring smiles, insisting that the system was sound, that deposits were safe. But their words were hollow, their eyes filled with the same fear as everyone else's. A contagion of terror spread faster than any wildfire. People, stripped of their faith in digital promises, rushed to their local banks to pull out their cash, to hold something real. The banks, which had lent out far more money than they held in reserve in an intricate and fragile web of debt, couldn't meet the demand. They locked their doors. Temporary closure due to technical issues, the signs read. For your protection. But everyone knew it was a lie. The money wasn't there. The promises had been broken. Ben watched the chaos unfold from the quiet sanctuary of his farm. Through his crackling radio and slow internet connection, he witnessed the rapid disintegration of the world he once knew. He saw images of lines at gas stations that stretched for miles, ending at pumps that had run dry. He saw shelves at the grocery store stripped bare in a single afternoon of frantic hoarding. He saw the raw, primal fear in people's eyes, the same gnawing fear he had lived with his entire life, the fear of not having enough, of being one step away from ruin. But for the first time, he didn't share it. His wealth wasn't a number on a computer screen vulnerable to a hacker or a market crash. It wasn't a pile of paper in a vault he couldn't access. His wealth was lowing contentedly in his pasture. It was chewing its cud in his barn. It was real, tangible, and alive. One afternoon, a week into the crisis, a dust-covered luxury sedan, a car that screamed of forgotten wealth, drove slowly up Ben's long driveway. Mr. Caldwell, the bank manager, emerged. He looked like a ghost haunting the memory of his former self. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained, his face pale and haggard, his soft hands trembling. He got out of the car and looked around at the tidy farm, the healthy animals, the repaired fences, with a dazed, uncomprehending expression. "Thorne," he said, his voice a hoarse, broken croak. "The bank, it's over. The FDIC, the government, it's all gone. They're all gone. My savings, my pension, everything I worked for my whole life." He looked at Ben, his eyes stripped of all their former arrogance, now filled with a desperate, pleading humility. "I heard you have things, real things. My kids, they haven't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. The stores are empty. I have a wallet full of $100 bills, and I can't buy a loaf of bread." Ben looked at the man who had patronized him, who had judged him a fool for taking his money out of the safety of the bank. A flicker of cold, satisfying vindication sparked within him, but it was quickly extinguished by something else: pity. This man was a casualty of the same broken system that had nearly claimed him. He wasn't like Caldwell. He wasn't part of a system that collapsed on itself. He was a producer. He made things people needed to live. He nodded toward his smokehouse, where several cured hams hung in the cool darkness. "I've got cured hams. And I have more milk and cheese than my boy and I can use. Take what you need for your family." Caldwell's composure shattered. He began to cry, not with loud sobs, but with silent, shuddering tears that tracked clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "How?" he whispered, his voice choked with disbelief. "How did you know this was going to happen?" Ben looked out at his small, growing herd. Hope was pregnant again. The young bull calf, now strong and confident, was already a formidable presence in the pasture. "My grandfather told me," Ben said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a lesson learned in the crucible of fear. "You can't eat money." The weeks that followed, were a blur of organized chaos. The official currency was worthless paper. The government tried to impose order with rationing and curfews, but the fundamental trust that holds a society together was gone. In town, desperation curdled into ugliness. Looting and violence became common. But out in the countryside, a new economy began to emerge, an ancient one reborn out of necessity. It was an economy built on barter, on reputation, on the real, tangible value of goods and skills. And Ben, the man who had been the poorest farmer in the county, found himself, to his own astonishment, at its center. His neighbor, Joe Riley, whose thriving herd was now a gold mine of protein, had a problem. He had run out of diesel for his generator, and his milking machines were useless without power. He came to Ben, his usual bravado gone, his hat clutched in his hands. "Ben, I'll give you a full-grown steer for that bull calf of yours. A prime steer. I need a breeding bull, and you've got the best line around now." It was an incredible offer, a fortune in the old world's terms. But Ben had a better idea, one based on needs, not just value. "Keep your steer, Joe. You'll need the meat more. But I'll trade you the calf for your entire winter's supply of diesel from your big storage tank." Joe's eyes went wide. Fuel was more precious than gold. It was power, mobility, and warmth. "Done," he said in a heartbeat. The next day, a flatbed truck arrived, not with money, but with two massive 275-gallon barrels of off-road diesel fuel. Ben now had power for the next year. He had traded something he had created, a living animal, a genetic future, for something he desperately needed. The system worked. He traded fresh milk and hard cheese to Old Man Miller, whose supply chain had collapsed, and whose shelves were now filled with useless, overpriced metal, for a new set of tires for his truck and a full rebuild of the John Deere's engine. He traded 2 laying hens and a rooster to a nearby homesteader for a sack of heirloom wheat and corn seeds, varieties that could be saved and replanted year after year. He began to organize a community co-op, using his large, sturdy barn as a central trading post. Every Saturday, people brought what they had: firewood, preserved vegetables, mechanical skills, medical knowledge, and posted them on a large chalkboard. They traded for what they needed. A dentist repaired a farmer's broken tooth in exchange for half a pig. A woman who knew how to sew patched clothes for gallons of raw milk. Ben wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. He was a leader, a facilitator of a new, honest commerce. He was building a community based on the simple, unbreakable principle of real production and fair exchange. He saw farmers who had had hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank now trying to trade their useless account statements for a loaf of bread. They had been prudent, they had been safe, and they had been utterly and completely ruined. They had stored their grain in the leakiest barn of all, a financial system built on debt and digital promises. Ben had stored his in the field under the sun, where it could grow. One crisp autumn evening, a year after the collapse, Ben stood on his porch and looked out over his domain. The farm was transformed. The fields were no longer fallow. One was planted with the heirloom wheat, its golden heads heavy and ready for harvest, a sea of real wealth rippling in the breeze. His herd had grown to 10, a powerful, living symbol of real, compounding interest. The old John Deere tractor, its engine humming with new life, its metal gleaming, sat proudly in the barn, a testament to the power of barter. He was no longer just a man with a farm. He was the steward of a productive, self-sustaining ecosystem, a node of stability in a broken world. He finally understood the profound truth his grandfather had tried to teach him all those years ago. True wealth wasn't a number in a ledger or a stack of paper in a dark room. That was a fool's game, a child's fantasy of security. True wealth was production. It was the ability to create tangible value out of the earth, out of an animal, out of one's own two hands and mind. It was the calf born in the spring, the wheat harvested in the fall, the milk in the pail, the warm loaf of bread on the table. It was the capacity to provide for oneself and one's community, to have something real to trade when the paper promises blew away like dust in the wind. The world of high finance, of stocks and bonds and complex derivatives, had revealed itself to be a fragile, glittering house of cards. His world, the world of soil and rain and life and death, was the bedrock beneath it all. He hadn't gotten rich in the way the old world understood it. He had become wealthy, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never be poor again. The world eventually healed, but it was a different world, scarred and humbled. A new currency was slowly issued, one allegedly backed by tangible assets, and trust was painstakingly rebuilt, like a barn raised one timber at a time. The scars of the collapse remained, a permanent reminder to a generation that had learned a hard, brutal lesson about the difference between money and value. Ben's farm became a beacon of stability and prosperity in the recovering region. He expanded, not out of greed, but out of a sense of duty. He bought the adjacent lands from families who had lost everything, offering them not just a fair price in the new currency, but jobs working the soil, teaching them the principles of production and self-sufficiency he had learned. He never became a miser, but he never again trusted paper over production, promises over proof. One day, a sleek electric car, one of the first new models to appear since the recovery, purred silently up his driveway. A man in a sharp, new suit got out. It took Ben a moment to recognize him under the veneer of renewed prosperity. It was Henderson, the red-faced rancher who had bid against him at the auction, the man who had looked at him with such blistering contempt. He had once been the wealthiest cattleman in 3 counties, a titan of the old world. Now his face was gaunt, his arrogance replaced by a weary, haunted humility. "Thorne," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't offer to shake hands. "I lost it all, everything. Had it all in market funds, municipal bonds. The bank in my broker, they said it was diversified, safe as houses." He gestured vaguely at Ben's bustling farm, where men were loading sacks of grain onto a truck. "You, though, you bought those 2 heifers, I remember that day. I called you a damn fool. Told everyone in the diner you'd be bankrupt in a month." He paused, swallowing hard, the memory a bitter pill. "Turns out I was the fool. The biggest one of all." He looked Ben directly in the eye, a flicker of his old pride warring with his current, desperate reality. "I'm not here for a handout, but I need work. I know cattle better than anyone. I can still work. I'll do anything." This was the moment, the final closing of the circle, the symmetrical catharsis. Ben could have turned him away. He could have savored the victory, reminded Henderson of his scorn, of his own foolish pride. The old Ben, the one who lived in fear, would have craved that moment. But that wasn't who he was anymore. That kind of victory was as hollow and worthless as a pre-collapsed dollar. "I need a good foreman," Ben said simply, his voice calm and even. "Someone who knows cattle, who can manage the new herd on the west pasture. The pay is fair and the work is hard. You start tomorrow at dawn." Henderson stared at him, his mouth slightly agape, speechless. He finally managed a single, choked nod before turning and walking back to his car, his shoulders a little less slumped than they had been a moment before. Ben watched him go, not with triumph, but with a quiet, profound sense of peace. He hadn't just beaten the man. He had freed himself from the petty emotions that fueled such rivalries. His victory wasn't over Henderson. It was over the fear that had once ruled his own life, the invisible tyrant he had finally overthrown. And so, his destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old, a testament not to what a man can save, but what he can create. His story now belongs to the wind and the soil, but its power only grows if it is shared. For the greatest lesson was this: the world doesn't run on money. It runs on the real things that money is supposed to represent. But as one man learns to build with his hands, a darker question emerges. What becomes of those whose only tool is the very paper that failed? If this journey has taken root in your soul, then let it grow. For the most vital stories are those that refuse to die in the silence of a forgotten history.